All right, I think I'm going to start and we'll let more people in as they arrive. Um, Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a SID-W work group event. This is a joint event between two work groups, food security and agriculture and health and nutrition. And the event is called Exploring the Use of the Nutrition Sensitive Agriculture Design Guide. My name is Malvika Randive. I'm the program coordinator. And before we start with our speakers and our moderator, I just want to have a chance to lay down some housekeeping rules as well as introduce SID-W. So for those that may be unfamiliar with our organization, we are the SID-W's largest and most active chapter of the Society for International Development, an international network that was founded in 1957 to serve as a global forum dedicated to sustainable economic, social, and political development. SID Washington serves as a global town square for the international development community, bringing together people from diverse organizations, disciplines, and career stages in a neutral, independent forum to share information and discuss important issues and challenges facing our community, as we are doing today. There are different ways that you can get involved with us. You can visit us at sidw.org to see what our upcoming events are. And you can also sign up for a weekly newsletter through our website, or you can follow us on social media to stay updated with different events and opportunities to the organization. So we also have a membership poll that we've instituted to understand who our participants are and where you're joining us from. If you could take a quick moment. So it seems I'm having some issues using our poll, so my apologies. We will not be using our poll today. We will be sending out a link to for our post-event survey in the chat box towards the end of the event. But it'll also be sent right now in case you want to copy paste it and make sure you fill it out towards the end. We appreciate any feedback, and it helps us make our events more accessible as well as effective and something that our membership and other participants want to see. A few things to note for today: this event is being recorded, and the recording will be shared publicly through our networks and social media channels. We also have live transcription closed captioning available, and it can be activated through your own individual settings. So if you go to more and you press enable live transcription, that's how you can activate it for yourself. If you have any questions today, you can submit them in the chat box while the speakers are speaking. If you have a question that's specific to a certain speaker, please indicate what speaker you would like to be asked to. And you can also introduce yourself with your name and organization so you may be recognized while we're in the Q&A portion. I will turn it over to Sabrina Ambergy, who is our co-chair for one of our co-chairs for the Food Security and Agriculture Work Group, to introduce herself and her other co-chairs.
Great, thank you, Malvika. Good afternoon, evening, or morning to everyone. Thanks for joining us for this joint work group event on exploring the use of nutrition-sensitive agriculture design guide. Before we dive in, I will just take a minute to introduce my fellow co-chairs. First, Stephanie Vasquez is the co-chair of the Health and Nutrition Work Group, which is our co-sponsor for this event. Stephanie is also the USAID Portfolio Director at Bixel. I want to thank Stephanie for her time and effort in helping to bring this event to you today. I'm also very pleased to welcome Noor Sadiq as my new co-chair for the Food Security and Agriculture Work Group. Noor is currently Chief of Party for the Center for International Research, Education, and Development at Virginia Polytechnic and State. He leads the USAID funded Catalyzing Afghan Agricultural Innovation Program. He has worked in international development for over 13 years and has worked on numerous programs, primarily in agriculture and higher education, as well as working in the public sector. I think he's going to bring a great new perspective to the work group. Noor is replacing Mark Castellino, who I'd also just like to thank once again for his tremendous service the last couple of years. Now to the event at hand, I am pleased to introduce our moderator for today's event, Dr. Emily Bobrow. Dr. Bobrow is a behavioral scientist with almost 20 years of experience working in global public health in Africa and South Asia. Her expertise includes maternal and child health, public health nutrition, prevention of mother-to-child transmission of HIV, quality improvement, and capacity strengthening. Currently, she serves as Senior Capacity Strengthening Advisor at ICF, where she's on the management team of the USAID funded surveys for monitoring and resilience in food security. And in this role, Dr. Barbara leads the design, implementation, and monitoring of the project-wide capacity development strategy. Emily, welcome, and thank you for moderating for us today. I will now pass it over to you.
Thanks, Sabrina. Thanks for that introduction and for bringing this event together. It's nice to have the two working groups work together. So I would like to just introduce our speakers and get us going. Again, if you have questions throughout, please put them in the chat and I'll make sure to keep track of them. And it looks like we'll have time to have people maybe also unmute and ask their questions directly if we have time for that. So we have three speakers today, and I'll introduce all three of them at this point and then refer you to each of them as they begin to speak. Our first speaker today is Anne Maselli. She's the Technical Director of Capacity Strengthening for USAID's Advancing Nutrition. She's been with AID Advancing Nutrition since 2019, where she works to strengthen approaches to strategic planning, organizational development, training, and mentoring with USAID and other partners. And she has a breadth of experience and has worked all across Africa and the Middle East. The second speaker is Helen Ofterheide, who is our food systems technical specialist with USAID Advancing Nutrition, and she's also been there since 2019. She also has a lot of experience in East and West Africa and has worked on sustainable farms both in the US and in France. And she was a Peace Corps volunteer in Benin in West Africa. And the final member of the team today is Alex Adel. He is a senior technical advisor for USAID's Advancing Nutrition project. He's worked in over 30 countries all over the globe, Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe, and has provided a lot of hands-on capacity building support and organizational development throughout his career. So I'm happy to move the conversation forward and start with Anne. So Anne, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Emily. Thank you for that introduction. And I want to say thank you to Sid Washington. Thank you for inviting us to be here and to share a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing over the last couple of years. So today we've been asked to share with you a little bit of background about the Nutrition Sensitive Agriculture Design Guide Community of Practice. And I will start out giving you some background about the Nutrition Sensitive Agriculture Design Guide. I'll tell you sort of what it is and give you some background about how it was developed. And then Helen will talk more specifically about the community of practice. Can we have the next slide, please? Oh, you know what? I think I have controls here. So this is the team. We're going to be, the three of us will be presenting to all of you. Emily just gave a very generous introduction for myself and Helen and Alex. So you'll be hearing from the three of us today. The next slide. So our agenda for today includes some of these items. We've already done our introductions. And as I mentioned, I'll tell you a little bit about how and why the design guide was developed. Helen will give you an overview of the community of practice and its goals. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the current and future activities of the community of practice, kind of where that's going, and then share with you some information about how you can join. At the end of this discussion, at the end of this session, we'll have some time for discussion, and we're really excited to hear from you about some of the concepts that we've brought up, some of the questions you have, and we're happy to share with you some background about our work and our perspectives on some of the work. Next slide, please. So what is the design guide? Basically, the Nutrition Sensitive Agriculture Design Guide was something that was requested by USAID, both of Advancing Nutrition and of our predecessor, the Spring Project. The first draft of the design guide was developed back then under the Spring Project, and we've continued to refine the design guide under Advancing Nutrition. We developed the design guide. USAID had asked us to develop the design guide because of a really common problem. Across USAID's activities, we were seeing a number of agriculture activities that wanted to achieve specific nutrition goals. But when they would design these activities, of course, they were designed from an agriculture perspective. And we often saw a bit of a leap in the logic from agriculture activities to nutrition outcomes. And this design guide was specifically developed to help chiefs of party and activity teams to really think through how to more effectively design those activities, really to get at those nutrition outcomes and the specific nutrition outcomes that we're looking for, to not have their goals be too much of a stretch, but have goals that agriculture activities can reasonably achieve in the timeframes that they have available. We know there are a lot of challenges out there. And so this guide was really specifically developed to encourage activity teams to engage in really sound activity design. So in a nutshell, this design guide, it's a facilitator's guide for a 3-day workshop, and it's meant to be peer facilitated. In various iterations of this design guide workshop, sometimes it's the chief of party who is the lead facilitator for the design guide workshop. Sometimes it'll be one of the technical leads, and often the facilitation over the 3 days is handled by multiple people who are part of the activity team, but it's really meant to be peer facilitated. And the design guide, the Nutrition Sensitive Agriculture Design Guide workshop, really helps walk that group through a series of strategic planning steps. And those strategic planning steps help to evaluate the activity and really look at its feasibility to achieve nutrition outcomes. So here's an outline of the guide and how it's set up. The guide starts off with an introduction to nutrition sensitive agriculture, and then it takes the group through step one. Step one is prioritizing outcomes. So as we deliver this workshop, we put forward a set of outcomes that are reasonable for agriculture activities to achieve that really relate to nutrition. And there are 6 outcomes that we really focus on in this facilitator's guide. And the first steps that participants go through is evaluating those outcomes and really seeing which ones are most relevant to their particular program. So we help these activity teams really pick the end goal where they want to end up first, and then we walk them through how to work toward that goal. So once these activity teams have prioritized the outcomes that they want to be working toward, then we go through step 2, which is to prioritize strategies. So if these are the outcomes that we want to achieve, what strategies do we need to use in order to arrive at those outcomes? What steps do we need to take to get there? And then of those strategies that we think might work, which strategies should we prioritize? Step 3 is to develop practices and interventions. So again, this is going from our end goal and then getting more and more specific as we work sort of backward from that end goal. Once we have outcomes and strategies, then we're developing practices and interventions. So what specifically do we need to do to put those strategies into practice? And those strategies will then help us achieve the outcomes. Step 4 is defining the monitoring indicators. So as the very last step, we kind of look at this bigger picture, and then we look at what monitoring indicators might be most helpful or relevant for this specific activity. And these monitoring indicators are usually a mix of USAID standard indicators and some custom indicators that are particularly relevant for activities. And then as a last step, we ask the activity team to really define where they want to go from here. And so as they define what to do next, they'll then look at how to integrate this thinking about their activities into some part of their work planning process. And this design guide workshop, activity teams can use this design guide workshop at a couple of stages in their activity. It can be used during the initial planning stage when an activity is first considering what do we want to put into our proposal, or once our proposal is accepted, how do we build out our work plan? So before the activity even begins, this workshop can take place and be beneficial for the activity team. It can also be used as part of a midpoint review. So when the activity kind of reaches its halfway point, if members of that activity are thinking, okay, how can we strengthen our nutrition outcomes that connect with what we're doing? This workshop will really help that activity team to think through that very carefully. And at the midpoint, that can lead the activity team to make some really critical adjustments and shifts that will help the activity to achieve its nutrition goals over the remainder of the activity lifespan. And also, this workshop could be implemented at the end of an activity. So as an activity is closing out, this workshop can be used to kind of review the progress that's been made so far. And it can be used as a kind of analysis as to how well that activity was really able to achieve those nutrition outcomes that it set out to achieve in the first place. So this can be used in a couple of different places for activity teams. So on the next slide, this just illustrates the steps that I just described, the 4 steps that get outlined in this design guide workshop. The way that we walk participants through it is we ask them to create this matrix step by step. So on the left-hand side, you have the outcomes that the activity has decided they want to achieve, and then they work toward the right. And the way this workshop is set up, this matrix is completed incrementally throughout the session, from session to session. And it's really meant to bring together members of the activity team who have a background and expertise in agriculture, economic development, and those who have a background in nutrition. So it's meant to help facilitate that conversation among those different groups of people on the activity to engage in this strategic planning that ultimately will lead to agriculture activities that have sound nutrition outcomes that they're able to achieve. So this is roughly the picture of how that goes. So in terms of how this was developed, I mentioned when I started out that this design guide was created under Spring and then finalized under Advancing Nutrition. We have pilot tested this design guide a couple of times. It was first pilot tested in Guatemala under Spring, and it was pilot tested again in the early years of Advancing Nutrition in Rwanda with an activity called Hingaweze. And the Hingaweze activity, the Hingaweze Feed the Future activity, was really one of the first activities to really embrace this design guide. And the strategy we used as part of this pilot was really to hand that activity team the design guide and kind of say, all right, pick this up, see how well you can use it, see if the facilitator's guide makes sense. And then we're here to support you as you have questions. And so our engagement with that team in Rwanda really helped us to understand a couple of things. One, we really believe in this peer facilitated model. Overall, it was challenging for this activity, for members of this activity to facilitate in front of their peers, but that model really led to the best conversations within the activity team. You had all the key people there to engage in that conversation. So we wanted to find a way to continue to make this a self-led workshop. At the same time, what we saw was the members of that activity team had a lot of questions for us, and that it wasn't very easy during that pilot for the people who were facilitating sessions to actually just pick up that design guide, read it, and know what to do if they've never seen this workshop facilitated. And so we recognized that during this pilot, the facilitators really needed additional support in order to deliver this design guide workshop. And so what those of us who helped develop this guide, we were there in the room, and during the breaks at the end of each day, we were helping to troubleshoot and support and guide and answering some of the more difficult questions that came up. So we recognized that role for us was needed, but at the same time, we also recognized the limitations of having somebody who's Washington-based or internationally based to be always needed to support this workshop. And we didn't want to create financial barriers to activity teams who really wanted to facilitate this workshop. And so as part of that solution, we designed this community of practice as a way to help activity teams understand the design guide better, tap into support when they're preparing to facilitate the design guide workshop, and also to share their experiences with each other. And the Hengawese team that we worked with in Rwanda has been a part of our community of practice on and off since we started it. And they've made really interesting contributions in terms of being able to actually share from the perspective of an activity who is using the design guide and the outcomes after the design guide workshop. So that's been a really critical step for us and for USAID in understanding how we can provide support for this design guide workshop in the most efficient way possible. And so that's a little bit of the history of how this design guide was developed. And I'm going to hand back to Emily for a moment. We're going to take a pause here and answer a couple of questions before we delve more deeply into the community of practice itself.
Thanks, Anne. That was really interesting, a really good background and information on the guide. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'm going to ask a couple. But if people do have questions, do put them in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand or unmute and let us know your questions. I know you said it's a 3-day design to be a 3-day training. I'm curious how you split up the days with the peer facilitators. Is it always in person, or do you feel like in these COVID times with so much virtual that it could be adapted to a different time frame and to a different sort of in-person versus virtual setting? So I'm curious about those adaptations.
Thank you, Emily. Yeah, I think you've asked I was about to say the question of the day, but I actually think it's the question of the last 2 years. Like, how do we make these things happen in the environment that we're in? And I'll tell you, we haven't ourselves actually delivered this virtually, but we have designed it in a modular fashion. And I think it would not be terribly difficult to adapt much of this virtually. The challenging part is that that strategic thinking among members of a team often happens best, that back and forth often happens best when members of that team can actually be in the same room. And so while it certainly is possible to break this up into like 2 or 3 hour chunks and deliver parts of it virtually, if at all possible, I think you would want that time for the back and forth among members of the team if they could be in the same room. And we've all adapted in different ways to online collaborations. And maybe this reveals a little bit of my bias, which is I still believe those in-person engagements are the most dynamic or the most enlightening. I still miss them terribly. We've got our jam boards, but I wouldn't hesitate to go back to flip chart paper.
Yeah, I hear you. The other thing I just wanted to clarify, my understanding is that it seems like the design guide is really focused at an organization working in a community. Are there community members maybe who come into it to provide like a more sort of cultural specific context? Or, you know, I'm a little more curious about the audience for who would actually use the design guide.
Yeah, so it really is members of the development organization who are implementing a program who would be the users of the design guide. The design guide itself is not really intended to be used by members of the community. Having said that, when the design guide workshop is being delivered among this activity team, that community perspective should be represented. And so if this workshop is being done at the very start of an activity, if it hasn't launched yet, there should actually be a context assessment that has been done that helps those activity team members understand what's actually happening in the community so that that community perspective can be brought in. And certainly if this workshop is done later at the midpoint or at the end point of an activity, those members of the activity team should have been out there working in the field and should be, I would expect, should be pretty well versed in that community perspective to bring it in.
Yeah. That's great. That really helps. I really enjoyed hearing about how it could be used at different time points, at that planning phase, at that midpoint evaluation phase, and then at the end. I really appreciate that. My last question just at this point before we hand off to Helen was about translation. You mentioned piloting it in a Spanish-speaking country, so I didn't know if it is also been all of the materials and the guide itself has been translated into any other languages.
Yeah, I think you've touched there on the question that everybody always wants to know, hoping that the answer is yes. We did, with the first country we piloted it in was a Spanish-speaking country. And since it was a pilot, we actually did not translate these materials. We probably translated the slide set at the time, but I do know that the facilitator's guide was not fully translated or professionally translated. We used a bilingual facilitator to facilitate that engagement. And so at this moment in time, we don't have a formal translation of this design guide in Spanish or French. And Helen, you can correct me if I misstated, but my understanding is to this point, we actually haven't translated it, but we do know how great of a demand there is to have materials in both Spanish and French, because that opens so many doors for access. So it's something that we're looking at, but haven't done yet.
Yeah, I hope that is a priority for some funding to make sure that these tools are accessible for a wider audience. Just easier in your sort of other languages as well. All right. So Anne, thanks for those questions, the answers to my questions. Again, I don't see any others yet in the chat, but everyone participating, please feel free to put your questions as we move on to the next section with Helen about the community of practice. So over to you, Helen. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Malavika, could we go to the next slide, please? Great, so Anne kind of covered an overview of the design guide itself as a tool, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the community of practice that we've developed around this tool. And so to frame the focus of our community of practice, we kind of outlined these 5 primary goals. And so first off, as Anne said, we're aiming to promote uptake and use of the guide and delivery of the workshop. We're trying to encourage members to share their experiences using the guide, support members in adapting the materials to their activity context as needed, developing some of those facilitation skills they need to deliver an effective workshop, and overcome any challenges using the guide. We also want to kind of solicit feedback to see how we need to change the guide or make updates to the guide to better meet activity teams' needs, and if there's other resources we need to make that, to develop that can be used in tandem with the guide. And then finally, of course, we need to make sure that this community of practice is the right mechanism to be achieving those other goals. So, doing an annual pause and reflect. So next slide, please. Based on those goals, we have a kind of a very specific audience that we want to, the audience one. But based on those goals, we're hoping to attract a very specific audience. And so the first group we're aiming to bring into the community of practice is individuals that are interested in using the guide. And then the second group is individuals who've already used the guide, who've designed activities, but want to continue to adapt and refine their activities over time. So those are the kind of the 2 primary groups we're aiming to get in this community. So I'm going on to the next slide, which is what makes this community of practice unique. Malavika? I don't know, maybe there's been a...
Yeah, Helen, do you want to start sharing your screen with your slides?
I can open that up.
So just bear with us, yeah.
Okay, great.
These kinds of technological problems are becoming the norm these days, aren't they?
Yes.
if it's not a computer crashing, it's dogs barking and children peeking in the screen. So I'd say we're doing okay.
Yes, I have told mine to stay away for for the time point of this session.
Anne, I sent them to you. Would you mind opening those up?
Oh, yes, I will do that. Give me just a second. And
Oh no. I feel like the computer freeze is always at the worst time.
Yeah.
it is. Okay, bear with me just a moment here. Hold on. Let me put my microphone on mute.
Helen, do you want to keep talking about what makes the community of practice unique?
Yeah, no, I can go ahead. Okay, so we recognize that there are other community of practice platforms out there that focus on broader topics related to nutrition sensitive agriculture and food systems as a whole. And I'm thinking of like Ag to Newt, which I imagine many members are a part of, which is a wonderful resource for technical content in this area. And we're really not trying to duplicate efforts with these existing platforms. And we have a very specific mandate for this community of practice. And it's kind of a unique approach that we're taking for a community of practice. But we saw this community as a way to leverage and a way to access a larger group of people and provide support over a longer period of time. So if we'd done a training of trainers, for instance, it would have been a smaller group over a few days. And so we're hoping that this longer engagement will help us support activities in not only designing activities, but adapting and refining, as kind of Anne talked about in the beginning. And also kind of an online forum provides a way to do some more of that user-to-user discussion that we were talking about. And that's something we're really working on as we're building our membership and building engagement over time. And we envision this community of practice as a way to kind of draw out those lessons learned from activity and project teams that have used the guide and have, support them in sharing those experiences with other teams having similar experiences or facing similar challenges. So if we can move on to the next slide, Anne, just kind of outlining what this community of practice actually is, because they can come in many different forms. But first off, we knew this community of practice needed to be virtual. We started this during COVID, and we're also, as you'll see a little bit later on, we have a very global audience. And we considered a variety of online platforms to start off with. But there are some more advanced and sophisticated platforms and some simpler ones. We ended up deciding to go with a very free, simple, email-based listserv for this community because we were kind of thinking of the long-term scope of this activity. If there are members that become actively engaged or another organization that wants to take this over time, we wanted that to be an option. So we have like a free platform that could continue going on beyond the life of our project. And we're unsure if that drive is there, but it's something that we factored into our initial design. So we have this listserv called Groups.io where the community is largely housed, and it links to a resource page on our website at USAID Advancing Nutrition. And of course, the most important part of this community is the 136 members that I think it's around there. It changes a little bit, but that's roughly where we sit right now with membership. And so we launched this community of practice in late January of 2020, and we disseminated it through our networks. And I'm sure some of you might have received the invite to join. And so can we go to the next slide, actually? So we sent an entrance survey for members when they joined the community of practice. And it was optional, so we have, I think, 90 responses out of the 130, 140 members here. But it gives us somewhat of a picture of a good majority of our members. And so when people join, we ask them, why did they join this community of practice? We wanted to get a better sense of their priorities and whether they actually understood what this community of practice was about and whether there was actually a demand for what we wanted to provide. So about 40% of participants said, yes, they plan to deliver the workshop, so that's good. 20% wanted to network and learn from other members' experiences using the guide. 14% wanted to gain knowledge related to nutrition-sensitive agriculture program design and implementation. Another 14% wanted to share experiences and knowledge related to the guide. And about 12% wanted to use the guide in other ways. So they want to adapt it for design trainings, curriculums, or for other research. But all in all, it looked like there's an interest for and these kind of aligned with the goals we laid out for our community of practice. So moving on to the next slide, we also collected information about where our community members live and where they work. And so just to give you a general picture, most people live in Africa or Asia, which is kind of a broad categorization, but it gives you a general sense. And also they work in Africa and Asia and a sprinkling in North America as well. But those seem to be the principal areas where our members are working and living. Moving on to the next slide. We've been active for about 9 months now as a community of practice. And so before we launched this community of practice, we kind of built the bones and infrastructure for this community. And so that started with developing a charter that laid out the purpose, the goals, the roles and responsibility. And we also developed a management structure. So we organized a steering committee, which currently includes us at USAID Advancing Nutrition and USAID. And we are thinking about bringing members onto that over time as our community develops. And in our first steering committee meeting, we kind of organized an evaluation plan, a plan for kind of monitoring our progress towards our goals over time. And so currently that just generally includes collecting information on membership responses to post, what topics of posts they're responding to, registration to events and what the events, topic areas the events are on, and also kind of some surveys we shared for member feedback. And then we've also started to establish linkages with other organizations. I missed one there. So we shared 35 pieces of unique content. So that's include email-based posts and office hours, and I'll describe that a little bit more moving on. But we've also started to establish linkages with organizations like SID Washington and Feed the Future Hingaweze, which Anne mentioned. And some, Ag to Newt, somebody from their organization might help create a post at some point. So we're kind of been looking for ways to develop content with other organizations and discuss how their work links into the design guide. So on the next slide, so just talking a little bit more about our process for developing content for the community of practice. We developed an initial calendar and timeline for content based on that survey, once we understood what participants were generally interested in. But we've really changed it over time and been really flexible as we realized that some things work and some things don't, and there are some areas where participants were more interested. And so over the course of the last 9 months, we've covered a number of topics. And so that's been an orientation to the guide. Where do you start? Who should facilitate, for example. We've talked about technical concepts in nutrition and agriculture. So, we kind of introduced that activity matrix that Anne shared earlier and what the nutrition sensitive agricultural outcomes are. And then we talked about how activities might need to adapt the guide if they feel their team doesn't have a strong background in nutrition or nutrition sensitive agriculture, how they might need to pull some other content in at the beginning before delivering the guide. And we've done some facilitation basics. So Alex has kind of been our point person for this, and he's developed some great materials to help people that are less experienced with facilitation to help their team reach those key decision points in the workshop. So, talking about setting priorities, brainstorming, overcoming disagreements in groups. And then we've developed some content related to social and behavior change and how that relates to the guide. So kind of breaking down how do you decide which behaviors you need to reach your outcomes in the workshop. And so breaking down some of those more complex technical concepts. We've been trying to get more members to share their experiences using the guide. And this is an area where we've had some traction, but we've room for improvement. And then, of course, guest speakers. So we had Hingaweze, for example, and we're always interested in hearing from other voices and their experiences using the design guide. So going on to the next slide. We have faced a number of challenges, and this is definitely not a comprehensive list, but just an overview of some things we've encountered over the last few months. So one key challenge has been member engagement and responsiveness. You know, it takes a lot of time to cultivate a community of practice and demonstrate the value of participating in this community of practice. And we've been really trying to identify some of those early adapters and, you know, harness their enthusiasm to start the discussion on the platform. We've also said we've had some trouble kind of generating that member-to-member discussion. Members tend to ask us questions versus responding to each other's posts. And so that's something that we're thinking about, how to generate more of that. And then maintaining the focus on the guide. As I said before, the value of this community of practice is really its narrow focus on this particular tool, but we have, you know, people asking broader questions about their interest in nutrition-sensitive agriculture as more broadly. And so we're always trying to kind of tie it back to the guide. For example, Alex's facilitation posts might be more general on facilitation, but he always highlights how those techniques can be used in the workshop. And then the functions offered on the platform. We selected a free platform, and that means that we can collect some more limited information about how people are interacting. So we can't see who's viewed a post, only who responds. And there's no chat function. So it's kind of a limited email-based listserv. And so that's something that we have to think about a little bit more. So just going on to our future activities, the next slide. So we are planning a series of activities around the guide to kind of complement this community of practice. So starting out this project here, we're adding a technical assistance component. So you might see information about this coming out too if you're part of USAID Advancing Nutrition's network, but we're planning to provide direct support to some activity teams planning to deliver the workshop. So that's going to be, you know, organizing calls to talk about how to adapt the guide for their context and reviewing their materials. And we're planning to kind of document and share some of their experiences on the community of practice. We are planning to host a training of trainers for the design guide in Washington, DC, hopefully in person this spring. That's currently planned for 10 to 15 facilitators. And that will kind of walk through some basics of facilitation and break down some of those case studies and exercises that are in the guide. We're always considering new techniques to engage members and generate more member-to-member discussion, whether it's, you know, getting more guests to write posts or, you know, drawing out some experiences from these other activity components we're adding. And then we're considering and transitioning to a newer, more advanced community of practice platform. That's just a consideration down the line. So on the next slide, this sounds like a resource that's relevant for you or activities that you work with, we encourage you to join. So to join, you just go to groups.io, make an account there and search for the NSA Design Guide and request to join that particular group. And so I think at this point, I'm going to hand it over to, I think, Emily again for any questions at this stage, and then we'll move on to Alex.
Great. Okay, I have some questions actually. We have a Google Doc with some questions, and one of the ones that actually came up to me too, so I'm glad somebody put it here. Helen, can you talk more about what types of content are available through the community practice? Is it documents? Is it videos? Is it interviews? Is it events? Like what do the actual posts that you post look like? What does the content look like?
Yeah, so there's a variety. We tend to have weekly posts that are more kind of focus on those areas I discussed before. We've kind of gone through kind of different thematic areas. So maybe breaking down a key technical concept in the guide, or and those are just kind of email-based posts. And sometimes we've linked to a couple other tools. So I know we've linked to some other tools related to SBC and described how those can be used in tandem with the design guide. And for the office hours, those have been largely monthly and focused on a particular topic area related to the guide. So Feed the Future Hingaweze gave a 10-minute presentation and then opened it up for questions about their experience using the guide. Alex is leading a office hours discussion tomorrow about facilitation techniques. And so I think he's going to give like a 10-minute overview of, breakdown of what he's talked about in recent posts. And then we open it up for like a question and answer period. That's just most of the discussion is quite open. And so there's a variety of different techniques, but those tend to be the two primary ways we engage.
And I'm curious, what do you feel is missing? You talked about how you're exploring other platforms with other functionalities. Like what do you feel like would enhance the community of practice?
Yeah, so I think the email-based listserv we have right now does have some glitches sometimes because it is a free platform. And I think, this something that we talked about is having a platform where there's a chat function embedded. We're limited in, the length of videos that we can share on the platform. So we have to link to other resources, which is always taking people away from the community of practice itself versus keeping them on the platform. And then also just those things about, tracking and evaluating how members are engaging. So most members passively engage by probably reading posts as opposed to responding. And so we don't know, it'd be helpful to know what people are reading, where people are going to look for resources. And so we can continue to develop that content versus, we're a little bit blind right now about that passive engagement and what people are interested in.
And maybe I can just add onto Helen's response.
Yeah.
One of the things that we've been really mindful about with this community of practice from the beginning is that sustainability question. USAID Advancing Nutrition was funded as a 5-year project, and we've got about 2 years remaining, but we recognize 2 years is not forever. And so when we chose the platform that we did, one of our considerations was that we wanted a platform that was effectively free or very low cost, so that it would be easier to hand that platform over to someone else who might be able to manage it, or potentially make it a peer managed platform if we had enough interest and enough members. And so that's one of the things that we're weighing when we look at some of the features that would be helpful in a platform and some of the advantages that were behind why we made the choice that we did. But I think a lot of members on this call probably can relate to that, some of the challenges of that sustainability question.
I'm curious how you've been promoting the community of practice. I'm thinking about the fact that I went to the website and I downloaded the guide and all the handouts and things. Is there a way, this is not my area. I mean, I'm thinking, is there a way that something could pop up and sort of say put in your email address since you just downloaded it, and that could be a way for you guys to send me an email and say, hey, Emily, you just downloaded the guide. Do you want to join this community of practice? Did you explore that? Is that something, maybe Alex knows a little bit more about that, but is that something that could happen? Or even a place when I do download the guide, I could put in my email and say, I'm interested in learning more about a community of practice. I'm just thinking of different ways for you guys to get to a wider audience.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I think you should talk to our web team. Yeah, I think we probably should could add that more of a prompt on the where the nutrition sensitive agriculture guide is on our website. We did a kind of a big dissemination campaign when this was first rolled out in the beginning. So we hit kind of all of our listservs and and a lot of other Feed the Future related listservs and agriculture nutrition listservs. And I think we're planning to do kind of when we when we promote this technical assistance component and this training of trainers, those will be other opportunities to gather interest related to the community of practice. And so I think that's one area we're planning to get some more traction. But I think that's also a great idea. But
Yeah.
I don't know if that's something that's possible on our current platform for the website.
Okay. There is a question which I feel like you talked about, but maybe a little bit more, Helen, about how this particular community practice does differ from others, like the one you mentioned.
Yeah. So how does this differs from those other Ag to Newt, those other broader listservs, again, because it's so much more narrowly focused. Everything that we do on the community of practice, we really try to tie it back to the guide. And, even when we link to other resources that might be, more general nutrition sensitive agriculture resources, we talk about how that can be used at this step in the guide and how you link this in. So we're really, it is a very narrow focus trying to promote uptake and use of this particular tool. And we're not trying to duplicate efforts with those broader platforms, and that has created challenges at times because we're interested in broader issues and our members are as well.
Great. Okay, there are a couple other questions that are a bit broader. So maybe Anne, start with you and then others can add in. There's a question here about, are experts in nutrition sensitive agriculture available to answer questions before or during the workshop? And how quickly are those questions answered? So I think this is more about sort of actually using the guide.
Sure. So I can start out giving an answer, but Helen, I think you're really more of the expert here. I do know that within Advancing Nutrition, we've got experts with a background in a range of areas, and those individuals are available for things like office hours or a consultation, or if we get a question that we can't immediately answer, we can draw on a really broad group of people to come in and provide a specific type of expertise. So that's kind of the first part of the answer to the question. Helen, you might know better than I do about how quickly questions on the community of practice get answered.
I think we haven't had many people asking broader questions that aren't related to specific posts. And so I think we generally would have people checking the community practice and they would be answered within a few days on the platform. But yeah, I think also thinking about that specific technical assistance for an activity, we've had less of that, specific activity-specific questions on the community practice. And I think that's also something we're trying to address with the technical assistance. If there's an activity that really wants more focused support, that would be maybe applying for this technical assistance activity that's upcoming, or the training of trainers. And so I think that we've had just a little bit less of that specific engagement on the community practice.
Okay. And then there's another question here that talks about how USAID has emphasized the importance of social and behavioral change in our programs. So when designing a nutrition sensitive agriculture activity, are teams guided to use sort of an SBC strategy or focus in their work?
I'm going to ask Ashley to answer this question as our SBC and guide expert.
Hi, everyone. This is Ashley Ackerson. I'm a senior social and behavior change advisor with USAID Advancing Nutrition. Within this design guide, one of the steps in thinking through things, once you've kind of figured out what your desired outcomes are, then you're kind of thinking about what strategies may help you get to these outcomes. And then as part of thinking about those strategies, we ask people using the design guide just to think through the very basic question, who needs to do what to achieve these outcomes? And then to think a little bit about why are these people not already doing that? So there's just some basic design thinking around how does one start to define optimal behaviors to help reach those outcomes that you're looking for, and then to think about what interventions might be effective in making those behaviors more easy, more desirable to do. And how could one go about creating an enabling environment for those behaviors through interventions and strategies, which kind of, the interventions kind of bundle up into strategies in this design guide. At the same time, we do direct people to other social and behavior change resources, like Designing for Behavior Change. And also Spring also developed, at the same time this design guide was being developed under Spring, we also, sorry, I'm a former Spring person. Spring also developed an online training, which is a total of 2 days, but again, is very modular and can be done, over time. Specifically looking at social and behavior change for nutrition sensitive agriculture. And there's a fair amount of overlap in the content, but the SBC training, the online SBC training just digs a little bit more into how would you use existing data to help to prioritize behaviors. If there are data gaps, how can you plan to do some formative research to fill them? And really getting a little more in depth in terms of linking, engaging specific groups, making it easier for them to do specific behaviors, and how does that all link up to outcomes? So it's just, there's a little more in depth in that online training. But even if folks are just using the design guide by themselves, there will be, there's a sample in one of the annexes. There are illustrative practices and interventions linked to outcomes and potential outcomes of nutrition sensitive ag activities. And so people can kind of draw on that to get them started in that thinking. And then as Anne and others have already said, by the end of the workshop, you will have that matrix filled out, which is at least a start toward defining some optimal behaviors to promote through the interventions.
Thanks, that's really helpful. It's nice to have you here to give that very specific answer about the SBC work. I definitely think you guys should put links to the website where the guide is in the chat so people can access that. I know after this is completed that SID-W will send out the recording and follow-up information, but maybe it's a good point now to just make sure and put that link in the chat. And Ashley, if you had another link that you wanted to, you mentioned the Designing for SBC resource, that any resources that you guys want to share from Advancing Nutrition might be great to just put in the chat, or at least make sure that we all get them with the recording and the follow-up information.
That's a great idea. I'm happy to do that.
Great, thanks. Okay, I've gone through my questions and the questions that I saw in the Google Doc. Does anybody else want to raise their hand or unmute themselves and ask a question at this point? Give you guys just a moment. Okay, Anne or Helen, is there anything else you guys want to add at this point yourselves? You guys have been very comprehensive.
I'd pass it over to Alex for some questions for everyone else, I guess.
Okay, yeah, let's move on. I'm looking at the time, we're doing good. So yeah, Alex, do you want to take over the next part?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, everyone. Great. So I think we've spoken a lot about the design guide and the community of practice, and I think this is a great opportunity to really learn as well from all of you. I mean, there's a wealth of resources in this room as well. So I'd love to kind of kick this off with a Menti polling. And so if you go to menti.com, and we'll put the link in there in the chat, go to menti.com and you should be able to see a link. You want to enter the code 89717153, and this should be able to get you into the poll so we can kick this off.
Great. Malavika, I'll take over with sharing the Menti results. Thanks.
Alex, can you put I'm not seeing it in the chat. Maybe it's just me, but are others doing this?
I'll re-put it in the chat.
Okay.
Does everyone have access to it? Great. Really, our first kind of question to ask is have you seen this nutrition sensitive agriculture design guide before? So is this the first time you've had an experience? It looks like some have, some haven't. And this is an opportunity as well to learn more about some of your experiences with potentially with the design guide, or how we might be able to support you in utilizing the design guide. So far, it seems that kind of half of us have had experience and have seen it, at least have seen the guide, and others haven't yet. As you note that we did put the link for the design guide in the chat, so please make sure to take some time to go to the link, download it if you haven't received it yet, and dig a little bit deeper into that. I think you'll find it really interesting. Let's move to the next question. So of those of you who have mentioned that you have seen the design guide, have you actually utilized it yet? Are you planning to utilize it? I'd love to get some feedback from folks and some thoughts about your thinking around the design guide so far from your experience of seeing it. So maybe we could have one or two people unmute themselves and just share, if you haven't used it yet, what are some of the potential reasons, or what are some of the areas that you think that this might be a possibility for you in the future? So is it that potentially maybe there's not a lack of opportunities, or does anybody have any thoughts on that?
You know, Alex, maybe I can just add, it's really great for us to kind of be in front of this audience that's really diverse in your sort of background and your focus on nutrition and sensitive agriculture. And we're particularly interested just in hearing from you kind of where your interest is about this design guide. And so we had hoped kind of at this point in the conversation to really have a little bit of a back and forth and kind of a deeper conversation to hear from you, both what you might be looking for from this design guide and kind of what are the bigger questions that come up in your work that some of our resources might be able to help answer. So please do feel free to jump in anytime and just kind of let us know what perspective you're coming from. We have some general information about this group from SID Washington, but we also wanted to take this opportunity really just to hear more about who you are and kind of what your perspective is. So don't hesitate to jump in.
I do see one comment from Lisa in the chat saying that her role doesn't really allow for her to use the guide itself.
Just to add, that actually makes a lot of sense to me, because this guide is really for a very specific kind of group or a very specific moment in time. But also, if you're working with teams in the field, that's one place where I think this guide is particularly applicable. And feel free to reach out to us and ask questions if you're wondering about whether this guide would work in your context or in your situation. We certainly can provide some perspective and background about whether it might or might not work. I'm sure you know, like, we don't get paid per download. So we can give you honest advice, and we'll tell you if it will work in your context or won't work in your context. Don't worry, we'll be real with you.
Yeah, Lisa put a little more information about how she's not a direct implementer, but she appreciates having the knowledge and being able to direct people to the guide. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, I am glad that, you know, in this virtual world that we've like embraced so much in the past 2 years with the COVID pandemic, that, you know, these kinds of events do get recorded, and that I feel like more people are, you know, accessing these kinds of recordings and listening to them in, you know, time zones that don't work to join from 3 to 5 in, you know, Eastern US, right? And since a lot of your community of practice members are, you know, in Africa, like this is not a conducive time for that group of participants to join. But it's nice that it's recorded and that this can be a resource, and that they now have access to the experts and can find you guys directly.
Great. And for all of those individuals watching the recording at some point in the future, please do also feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to answer questions.
Ian, could you share with us the uptake within USAID missions with the tool? There is some recent programs or announcements for nutrition sensitive agricultural programming. And just wanted to find out what the reception has been toward the tool, and if that aligns with what your tool was hoping to accomplish, or if there's been other things that you've had to adapt to make it work.
Thanks for that question. And Helen, you can probably add some onto my answer, because I know you've had different conversations with missions than I have. So the request for this, the design guide, the development of the design guide in the first place came from USAID Washington. And over the last year or two, we've been sharing this design guide with missions, and our colleagues within RFS have specifically been sharing it with Feed the Future, countries that are implementing Feed the Future programming in missions. And we often have had very, very good mission support once they've been introduced to this design guide, because missions often struggle with how to guide local programs to actually design really good activities that will achieve the set of outcomes that the missions are being held accountable for. And so in Rwanda, for example, it actually was the mission who said, we want some of our activities to use this design guide. And when Hingaweze, the activity Hingaweze, sort of volunteered and also expressed interest, the mission was actually right there in the workshop saying, you know, we're really excited to see the changes that are coming out of this design guide. And they were really behind us 100%. So in terms of like numbers and percentages, I think our colleagues at USAID Washington have a better sense of how many missions have expressed interest, but we've worked with quite a few who get behind this really quickly. Because in addition, there also is not that much guidance out there about how to do really good strategic planning or really good activity design. And while this design guide has a very specific niche, it's really designed to help agriculture programs deliver on nutrition outcomes. Like it's quite specific. In the bigger picture, the first time I picked up this design guide and read it, it was clear to me that this is really a strategic planning guide with a very specific technical focus. And so I think that's the kind of resource that is maybe not super common for missions. But I'm also happy for others to add. Helen or Alex or Ashley, feel free to jump in. I know you all have seen this from different angles as well.
Hi, this is Ashley. Just to say that I think we've also seen the guide and the contents of the guide being used to kind of take another look at theories of change, to see that, to look at outcomes which are proposed and really test the logic of those to see if those outcomes are feasible to achieve within the kind of scope and mandate that a project has in the operating environment that it's working in. So it can be a way to kind of help to push back a little bit on outcomes if some of the outcomes that a donor is holding you to may not be that feasible. You know, like many people are rethinking, you know, should reducing stunting ever actually be an outcome of a nutrition sensitive ag project? So this is a way to help think through those questions a little bit as well, or it can be.
Helen, you're still on mute. Oh, no, we can't hear you now.
Okay.
No, you're good.
I don't know what's happening there. No, I was just going to answer to the mission awareness piece. I think that's something we're trying to make this more available to missions, and it's part of something that we've shared with them recently as part of like a toolkit of tools that missions can use and could make available to their implementing partners. So I think that's something that we've been working on, and we've been trying to kind of make more missions aware that this is a tool that's available.
That's great. Do you guys want to keep going with the Menti poll? So Alex, you're still on mute. Okay, go.
I'm sorry about that. So for those of us who have designed previously or implemented nutrition activities, how many here have actually gone through this process? Who've designed, implemented, or evaluated nutrition sensitive activities? To get a sense of the room of the kind of experience we have in designing, implementing, or evaluating these types of activities. So we have a few folks. Great. Great, let's move on to the next slide. So when we think about designing, and this is really for the whole group, when we think about designing or implementing or evaluating nutrition sensitive activities, we've shared some of in our community of practice, some of the kind of the challenges that folks face. But we'd love to hear from you. What are some of the greatest challenges that you faced when designing or implementing or evaluating nutrition sensitive activities in general? So conflicting priorities, that's interesting. Any other thoughts? Yeah, focus of activity is too broad. I think that is something that we've also noticed and we've seen previously. I think one of the important facts of when we use the design guide is really to help partners to really focus in on those activities and really drive it. And I think the process that we use through the design guide, the design matrix, really helps folks get down to bring that focus in and kind of strips it to what are the essential interventions that are necessary to get to those outcomes. Overlap with other activities, trying to pinpoint how interventions tie specifically to nutrition interventions. That's really a good point. Cultural differences, and then household level versus systems level. Would anybody like to share and kind of unmute themselves and speak out about a comment or two that they've provided here? I'm quite interested, especially around some of the household level versus systems level thinking there. And or if anybody would like to talk a little bit more about the overlap, I think that's something that's common as well that we've noticed too with other activities and trying to really pinpoint specifically what is the nutrition intervention. And I think that from our experiences where a lot of folks get stuck. So I'd love to open up the floor to maybe share out a little bit more about that. If anybody has any additional thoughts.
It looks, go ahead, Alex. I was just
No,
gonna
it's
say,
okay, Ed.
we've got a quiet group here today. We've passed the 4 o'clock mark. I think, at least here in Washington, D.C., it's after 4 o'clock. So maybe everybody's winding down a little.
Yes, I can totally understand coming to the near end of the day. So it's totally understandable. I think we're all there as well in that regard.
Yeah.
I guess let's move on to. Yeah, sorry, Emily.
No, I was going to make a comment. I didn't write the comment about the overlap with other activities, but I would assume that that probably came from somebody who's an evaluator, just having that background as well, that it is hard to sort of, especially if nutrition activities and interventions are part of a larger project, right? That isn't as focused on either nutrition sensitive or specific items, that it's maybe talking about access to healthcare services in general, and there's a nutrition component to a project or something. It can be really difficult to attribute even any kind of link to, you know, improvements related to nutrition intervention. So I've come across that. I didn't write that comment, but it resonates with me.
Yeah, I appreciate that thoughtful comment, Emily, and I think that is it is a challenge, and I think, you know, with the design guide and the way it's set up is to really help you think through that and to break that out a little bit and try to make it a little bit easier for folks to think through, really kind of, and separate those interventions. But it is always a challenge. And also how we define different interventions and how they actually play out. Let's move on to the next question then, for sake of time. So just quickly for folks, we've shared out some of the resources that from the design guide. And as you know, as we mentioned, if you join the community of practice, we list a number of resources, but we're also interested in learning from our community here, and what specific tools or resources might you recommend to better integrate nutrition in agriculture or food security activities? What previous resources have you used or shared? Any thoughts on that? These are the kind of thinking or ideas that we'd like to gather so that we can really make sure that we can capture any additional thoughts. And maybe if now is not the time, maybe if you in the future, we could make sure that we collect that information from you as well. But it's really important, I think, to think through what additional resources or tools that we can gather that might be beneficial for others that we just haven't really thought of yet. And reaching out to all of you as a resource here might be a great opportunity for us to learn from. So thought I'd open it up there and see if anybody had any additional thoughts.
Oh, hi, Alex.
Yeah, hi, Noor.
Hi, how are you?
Great.
I would like to make some comments about all the questions that were there, and I'm listening, you know, working in the agriculture sector education. I think Anne mentioned this as well about the sustainability. One of the biggest thing is finding local partners that are permanently there. You know, the programs and the projects come and go, and obviously you want to leave something behind when you are done. And that's what it requires, all these questions that were there, whether it's the overlap, whether it's, I mean, the design guide is a great document. It's the holy document, but translating it into a practical guide or making activity based that you can share it with the locals and find local institutions to make it like part of the institutions, that it's institutionalized these activities is the challenge. You know, that's the biggest challenge, to find people. So for me, I've been working in Afghanistan for many, many years. And until I came to Virginia Tech, I really realized that the best partners in a country are educational institutions to work with, you know. So I'm part of the higher education community of practice as well, and this gives me a better chance. I mean, I delivered a lot of trainings through Virginia Tech to universities in climate smart agriculture, which including nutrition, you know, so we have experts as well. So finding that a team or an institution within the community to work with each other in creating a community of practice there as well is the most important part, you know. So that's what my experience is, to translating this guide into a practical, this design guide into a practical activity-based modules, and sharing it with the locals who are, you know, basically educated people, and then they working within the community and putting it into practice. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Noor. That was really, really interesting. Did anybody have any thoughts to that? Yeah.
Could I? Yeah, hi. Just to say, we agree, Noor, that this is, because this design guide is really aimed at a very specific audience, there are other complementary approaches that can be used to adapt this for community level workers, as you say, for local NGOs or even academic or training institutions. I'm just going to put in the chat here an example of a nutrition sensitive agriculture training that again was developed under Spring, but many of the people who developed this are also on USAID Advancing Nutrition. But that's one reason why it's nice to kind of establish a relationship with projects, because in addition to supporting the use of the guide, we could then help a project think through how to adapt some of the content of this, but make it experiential, make it participatory in a different way, and help people at the community level or at the local level make the connections between this kind of design thinking and what's going on in their local areas.
Well, and Ashley, I appreciate the other comment you put in the chat about using the design guide as a way, and you mentioned this too, to create a theory of change and really using it as a strategic thinking guide. I really appreciate that. It's laid out clearly as a methodology for that. And then I'm the one who put the comment about I love all the handouts and the definitions and all the supporting materials that you have available to download with the guide. I found those really helpful, even as just sort of teaching tools. So that's helpful to me.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, Noor, I appreciate that comment. And I think, you know, when we think about sustainability and really kind of local transitioning of tools and skills, you know, that first key element is that commitment level from those stakeholders, which means that they have to have that enthusiasm, they understand the importance and the need. I think one of the roles that we as in the community that we play is really providing greater exposure and really sharing the benefits of these tools and how they can be used at the local level, to really get them to see why it matters to them, why they would want to utilize this. And that further helps supporting them to adapt that tool. And so that's the kind of role that I think we can really support as a community within that. So I'll stop there for a second. All right, so
that's excellent. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was also going to say, I really also appreciate including academics and researchers and universities, as you said, in country, as trainers and educators. It's really, people tend to stay in those jobs longer. And so there is
Yeah.
a sustainability factor there. And if they
Yep.
do leave those positions, they're either leaving or advising often people in different ministries of agriculture, nutrition, health, and such. And they really have a good sort of network of people and the people who might be, you know, the implementers of using a guide like the design guide that we're talking about today. So I highly sort of remind people and recommend that we don't forget about the educators and using those networks and those people in country with that level of expertise. And usually they're fabulous trainers and teachers, you know, which is also kind of inspiring and what we're looking for. So
Excellent point.
thanks for that
Thank
comment.
you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, Alex, thanks for following up on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great. So I think we had just one last question, and we could, but I think we could just quickly, we could probably just do it out in the open here. We don't even need to go through the Menti, but really from kind of your exposure so far, for most of you, those who've seen it, those who might be interested in utilizing the design guide, and those who haven't, this is your first time, I'd love to get some thoughts from folks about how you might use the design guide in your work, or how you might promote the design guide or recommend it to others. And if you have any additional thoughts for us as well, and how we could better promote or share out the design guide as well and really communicate it out, we'd appreciate that too. So I'll stop now and just open up the floor for any additional thoughts on kind of how you might use the design guide.
Well, I can start. So Emily again. For me, I work for ICF and I'm a senior capacity strengthening advisor, specifically on a project called Surveys for Monitoring in Resilience and Food Security. And so our mandate, we just got the award from USAID in August of this year of 2021, and it's a 5-year funded project. And we are not direct implementers at all. We are doing a lot of the data collection on doing surveys in countries, looking at issues of resilience and food security. So I feel like a lot of the people that we interact with and that we will disseminate the findings from these surveys with are the people that would use the guide. So I feel like it's part of now my toolkit of resources to promote and to say, like, this might be something. Now you have all of this very specific information from all the surveys we've done, and now, like, thinking ahead, this is a wonderful resource and guide to use to think about how to do nutrition specific sensitive agricultural work and design the correct interventions. So I feel like it's a great tool for me to help promote and to promote the community of practice. Like I think that having that direct network and conversations is really essential and important for, sort of building all of our networks and making sure that people have places to ask questions and connect with experts. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. I think that's a really good point. And I think we want to make sure that we create that community that really thrives, so that as we talk about sustainability, we talk about having champions. We want to have global champions everywhere to be able to take this on. It really can't live with us. It has to live with everyone else, and really grow through that. I noticed that Susan mentioned you might use this for program annual year work planning. That's a great example, of utilizing a tool like this. So that's really wonderful to hear as well. Any last thoughts or any additional thoughts from our discussion so far? All right, well, I want to say thanks everyone's participation, and especially in this section. And I'll pass it over to Emily to kind of take us through the remaining.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to our three speakers in particular, to Anne and Helen and Alex for leading us through this really impressive piece of work that you guys have done. And I just really appreciate that you're backing up and supporting the guide with this community of practice. It's the way to do it, right? If you want to get your users more support, like this is a really sort of creative way, and I like that you're using a free platform for the community of practice and trying to think about issues of sustainability. All right, well, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie, who's going to sort of finish us out. Looks like we're going to end a little bit early, but I think that's a good thing on a end of the day, at least on the East Coast of the US. So thanks again to all the speakers, to USAID Advancing Nutrition.
Great, thanks, Emily. Thanks again for your role in facilitating this event. This has been really great in sort of moving the conversation along. I also want to thank Anne, Helen, and Alex for sharing your experience today in the development and use of the guide. But most importantly, I also want to thank Lisa Loxman, who was the engine that brought this event to SID-W. And so she helped to organize this event, and she brought together the working groups to help finalize the organization of this. And as Emily mentioned, also encouraging everyone on this call or who may be listening to this afterwards, really consider joining that community of practice. It seems like a really great opportunity to collaborate with peers who are interested in advancing nutrition in the agriculture sector. And finally, I am on the Health and Nutrition Workgroup, and I am the only co-chair, so I am looking for a second co-chair. So if anyone is interested in signing up or wanting to learn more, please feel free to visit the SID-W website to find out how you can apply to be a co-chair. It's really an opportunity to participate behind the scenes to develop these kind of events for your colleagues. And so we're looking for a second co-chair to join me to help lead these events. Finally, please do complete your survey link. I think Malvika mentioned that early at the start of the webinar today, so I think they'll repost that in the chat. We want to hear more about your feedback on this event so we can continue to improve for future events. And again, thank you everyone for participating in this event, and I'm excited to see you at the next SID-W event. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.